I think we're good to get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Modernizing Change Management webinar. Really excited to have you all here today. My name is Kalen Castell. We'll get into speaker intros in just a sec, but I'm going to kick us off today. Could you go to the next slide, Dan? All right, so I'm sure you've seen this slide many times, but before we get into the presentation, we're going to have the safe harbor notice here. There may be some forward-looking statements in this presentation. They're based on our best understanding at this point in time. Just don't take anything as set in stone. They could change. Go to the next slide. From an agenda standpoint, we're going to start with speaker intros, 2 primary speakers today. Then we're going to go into the primary challenges that we hear from customers around modernizing their change processes. We're going to talk about our perspective on a modern change solution. Then we're going to cover the key capabilities that comprise that solution. And then we're also going to showcase to you today a modern change maturity or adoption journey that we think is a best practice in enabling yourselves on these capabilities. And then we'll have pretty ample time for Q&A, but throughout the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom of Zoom to ask your questions. We have some moderators who will be looking at those throughout the presentation, answering as we go, also flagging some for answering live at the very end of the session. All right, next slide. All right, introductions. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Kalen Castell. I'm an outbound product manager with ITSM, focusing primarily on our modern change and release applications. With me today, I have Daniel Davidson. He's our true product expert. Dan, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Daniel. I'm the product manager for change management. Worked for ServiceNow for about 11 years. Previous to working as a product manager, I worked in the field doing leading implementations across EMEA for ITSM and a bit of ITOM too.
Great. All right. So before we jump into the presentation, we want to kick us off with a poll. So let me launch that poll really quickly. So we just want to see what modernizing change means to you. Does it mean increasing automation? Is it moving away from ITIL change types? Is it managing a high volume of change? Is it executing those changes more quickly? Perhaps it's more accurate risk management, or is it giving a better experience to the folks raising and processing those changes? Or maybe you have no idea. There's no wrong answers here. We just want to see what everyone here is thinking. Give you guys another 10 to 15 seconds for this. And just one housekeeping thing as you're answering this question. At the very end of this webinar, you'll be prompted to answer just a post-session survey that'll take just a few minutes. Please do respond to that. Your feedback's really valuable. All right, I think we got good respondents. I'm gonna end this and share the results. So it looks like 2 primary outcomes are coming out here. Most folks want a better experience for the folks who are raising and processing changes. And also there's a big desire for automation. We think that our modern change capabilities that we're going to cover today can help you with all of these things. So we'll jump into that now, and I'll hand it over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Caden. Yeah, we should probably run this this query again at the end of the call to see what we're going to talk about is how maybe not moving away, but maybe including other types of change outside of the ITIL change types will help with some of the other things that you've answered in here and kind of given us a strong indication that the outcomes you're after. Okay, so we're going to start with the kind of strategic vision of the IT organization. What problems are we having at CXO level? And we've identified 3 main personas that are talking about change management, talking about IT transformation, talking about digital transformation. So start with the CIO, who's made investments in technology. The investment in technology has increased rapidly over the past few years, as we've heard terms like digital transformation. So we're seeing new technologies, a rollout of cloud technologies, microservices, and new ways of working that they're investing in. And as that's happened, they would expect to see lower lower numbers of outages. They'd expect to see better performance and better customer satisfaction. And that doesn't necessarily translate into those outcomes for them. So they're asking questions about why. From a CTO point of view, there are new ways of working they've embedded in the business. So they've looked at things like DevOps, they've looked to more automation, they've looked at things like infrastructure as code, they've looked at things like site reliability engineering and application performance monitoring. And those things allow the IT organization to move faster, potentially, to be able to meet the business needs more rapidly. And that stops the organization getting competitive obsolescence as more and more of the business's products are either directly or indirectly delivered through IT. The need to be able to rapidly change what's delivered in IT is increasing. So we're seeing an increase in the volume and velocity needed for change from the CTO. From a CISO point of view, we can see that there's more compliance needed. There's more security vulnerabilities. There's more attack vectors coming into the system. There's more stuff that's in IT. There's more stuff that's being delivered digitally. So there's more potential for loss through security breaches. And as we see compliance increasing, we also see the need to deliver compliance reporting just in time. So rather than doing kind of 6 monthly or annual audits of compliance, we're asked to deliver results immediately. And so the impact of brand, the impact from security breaches, the number of fines, the complexity of compliance, the complexity of securing the systems, as we have hybrid systems, as we have still have stuff on-prem, as we move to different cloud environments, as we federate IT throughout the business and different teams take on different technologies to deliver the products that they need, that's become more complex too. And sitting at the heart of this is change management, because if you can't roll things out, if you can't get them into production quickly, then it doesn't matter what you've invested behind the scenes. If you need to be able to get them out quickly, what happens is if change starts being a blocker to these things, these changes start stacking up. So changes that were meant to be delivered really rapidly into a production environment start being delayed and start being stacked up into larger changes. And that in itself can affect stability. These changes were never designed to be stacked up and waited on. They were designed to be implemented straight away. And we know that having smaller incremental changes has a positive impact in stability. It also has a positive impact in the business's ability to deliver rapid change to customers, which is what they want to see, and innovate quickly. And the reason this is happening is we have teams working around the place. So we have siloed teams working, delivering stuff into production environments. We have operations teams that aren't necessarily seeing what's happening in the development environments that developers are using. And as we're rolling out security patches and security patching programs, and we need to demonstrate compliance, again, there's more pressure in that area. So the workload is increasing on change management. We're seeing more and more changes being delivered. We're seeing them having to be delivered faster. And that has a knock-on effect of sometimes slowing change down. So what we're going to talk about here is some approaches around how we can modernize change, how we can deliver within that envelope, how we can make higher volume changes more compliant, more stable, so we can deliver better volume, better velocity, better stability, and better compliance. So why transform change? Why do it now? So normal change has now become overloaded. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. Normal change has to cope for so many constituents around the business, and it's ill-suited for many of the change use cases. This could be dependent on a type of technology or the model that's being used to deliver that technology. So it could be a DevOps team, or it could be that we're doing cloud infra, or there's a very big difference in how we deliver technology to the mainframe in the AS400s as there is to a microservice-based application that's in the cloud. And we want to be able to innovate fast without increasing the risk, because by innovating fast, we're delivering things fast into production. We want to make sure the same checks and balances are applied to the changes that are being made that we've always done. We don't want to just create a risky environment and move fast and leave systems vulnerable and leave systems potentially more unstable. The legacy change process has become a bit of a black box. It's something that a lot of customers are kind of frightened to touch and move forward on because it's so complex. It's had to be adapted and it's had to kind of morph over the years to suit all the different types of constituents that are using it. So we've seen an explosion in the number of business rules, the complexity of the workflow that's attached to normal change, and it can seem quite impossible to transform. Again, we're going to make some suggestions about how we approach that change. And as we need to do more changes, we need to do them faster. We need to be less subjective about risk evaluation. We need to be able to highlight things that are risky and need people to be involved at looking at the changes, but we need to minimize those. So we're only looking at the changes that are really important and allow the other changes to flow through. And this follows through with an industry trend about change management moving back more to second line. So looking at concentrating on the changes that are particularly risky or that we don't have good data and good structure around, but allowing changes that have good data, good structure, and good practices, supporting those changes to move through with minimal or less approval. And to be able to do that as well, we need to be able to bring different piles of data together. We need to be able to take data that's in plan, build, test, and release. We need to be able to combine that with operational data, so that both teams can talk to each other, so that we have a full visibility of the picture, the full end-to-end pipeline that we have in our product deployment. So how do we do this? By using change models, we can start to decouple change. We can start to unpick the vast normal change that we have that's become complex. We can start to take things out of that box and start to have purpose-built models for the particular areas of the business to allow them to move at the velocity they need to move, leveraging the data that they have within their stack and the processes that they've built. By having integrations into their systems, we can start to have visibility of their data. We're not talking about having them work in ServiceNow. We're talking about them being resident in the tools they're used to working in, the tools that they've chosen, but bringing that visibility into ServiceNow so that we can look at it from the change and we can have it audited within the change process so that we can automate the change process. And so after the fact, operations teams can see what's happened or what is going to happen as a set of changes are deployed. We need to be able to use things like Gen AI and machine learning to evaluate changes. So we need to look at the wider picture of change and start detecting where we think there are patterns which could negatively impact stability, or that could cause us compliance issues. So we need to know where teams are performing well, where services are performing well, where particular types of change are performing well or badly, and we need to adjust the change process dynamically to suit those outcomes. And by combining this with approval policies, we can start to tailor approval dynamically to make the approval as light as possible in the situations where we have very little risk presented. But you can have a change, for instance, where one team doing it are extremely stable at what they do and another team aren't. And we need to be able to look at these things within approval policies, to take operational data into account, to take into account the things that and check the guardrails that should have been applied in processes like DevOps, and build that into the change process. And that means we need to have a different way of doing different changes. So what we're doing is we're breaking change down and starting to look at it as a set of components that we can wire together to make specific types of changes. And these go beyond traditional, normal, standard, and emergency changes. Okay, next question. Kaylin, do you want to do the question?
Happy to. Give me 1 second. All right, launching the poll. So this is a two-parter. First question is, are you feeling pressure at your organizations to modernize change from the business? If so, where is that imperative coming from and why? And the second part of this question is, what's the biggest challenge you're facing in modernizing change if you are feeling that pressure? So give everyone 30 to 40 seconds to answer this.
Seeing a bit more of an equal split here popping up.
Yeah. Ten more seconds. Okay, share the results here. So like Dan said, a bit more equal results on the first question. Seems like stability is the primary driver for a lot of us on looking to modernize change, increase focus on compliance, and also the business expects faster change processing to get innovate more quickly. In terms of challenges, seems like the two largest challenges for the group are getting buy-in, internal alignment. We hear that a lot, and also awareness of features. So hopefully that one will definitely be addressed in today's session. All right, Dan, back to you.
Okay. Oh, just have the poll up again. Okay, so we have a statement around how we move forward. So by taking a model-based approach to change, we can start to enable change to be broken up. And we're going to show that over the next few slides. We can allow you to adapt change to fit your constituents, to simplify the normal process as well, because the normal process also suffers stability issues in a lot of cases by being so complex. So by breaking changes out of the normal process, not only are we able to make those teams able to work faster, able to increase the automation in those teams, increase the stability that they can be delivering with their changes, we can also increase the stability of the changes we leave inside normal because we make that process less complex. So we can increase velocity and volume whilst we're also increasing the stability and the governance. So 3 change types that we know and love in ITIL, and we have no plans to retire these changes. Okay, so these changes will be around for a long time. What we have is standard change, and for those of you who don't know, so standard change is a repeatable change. It's a low risk change. It's a change that's highly templated. And what we do is we look at the performance, the past performance of this change. And if it is something that's low risk, if it doesn't cause us any particular outages or any particular problems, if it is something that we can drive through a template, if we know the performance of the teams making those changes is good, then we can allow them to make standard changes with 0 approval. But what this doesn't take into account are things like operational data points. So it could be that a standard change is allowed to be applied even when there's a P1 right now in a production system. So it has its limitations. The other thing is we need to constantly revise and look at our standard changes. There needs to be a process around proposing standard changes, looking at the templates. There needs to be a process around retiring them when we see the performance isn't so good with those changes. And also it's really all or nothing. We either see that a change is performing well, but one team doing something wrong with the standard change could then make that standard change unavailable for all teams. And that might not be the right thing to do. It might be the right thing, it might not be the right thing. We have emergency change. So emergency change is something that is a change of last resort. So we've either done something in a system that we had to do straight away and we're raising a change after the fact, or maybe something happened that was an unrecorded change that we're now applying a process to record the fact that system changed and apply some policy to it again after it's been done. And normal change is just everything else. So within this change, we need to be able to cope with all the different types of changes that hit the organization that aren't standard and that aren't emergency. And because of this, it becomes an incredibly complex change type. It becomes something that has lots of business rules normally, that has a really complex workflow, that has approvals in it that need to be able to cater for the worst possible situation and therefore slow down changes, which could be done much faster. So an example would be something that doesn't quite fit in a standard change category. Maybe we've had an issue with it in the past. Maybe it's just that we don't want it to happen in a production system without someone taking a look at it. And that change would then flow through the normal change process and would hit all the barriers that we would expect to hit for a large system change that's going through a normal change process as well. And although there are some nuances around looking at the risk of the change and routing it in the right direction, the more we customize the workflow, the more we take that workflow and route that change slightly differently, the more complexity we build in, the more business rules fire, the more complex change becomes, and potentially that change process then becomes very brittle to change. So this is why we're stuck in a paradigm of normal change, slowing us down, but not being able to move forward easily. So what people also do, so around the changes, again, we have these artifacts. So people are using workflow still for their changes, and it's sometimes difficult to move away from workflow because you've got so much built into it for the normal change. There's so much investment in that workflow, and maybe even sometimes a lack of understanding of what that workflow actually does. It would be a large-scale project to pick it apart and move it into more efficient flows. And the approvals are also baked right into that workflow, so it's difficult to pull them apart. And then there's a set of business rules around the normal change as well that have so many conditions on them to hit the different types of changes. Again, it's kind of it's kind of difficult to see how you would start to decouple things in change, how you would start to have different change types. So to move away from the ITIL change types, we need a different approach. So again, looking at the constituents within normal change, we've just got some examples here. Other types of change do exist, other models of change do exist, and we encourage you to find your own models and make your own models. But actually within normal change, this is what we're coping with. And we can see in emergency change too, we've got unauthorized change as part of emergency change. So it has to follow the same process as emergency change, even though it's a very different type of change. And we know some customers as well do DevOps as part of standard change. This is an example of where standard change is being used to cover something to make it work faster, but actually DevOps is not a standard change. They're not repeatable changes. They're not necessarily low risk. The reason we're using standard change to do this is because we want those changes to happen fast. But it's not the best way of doing things. What we should be doing is we should be inspecting the data coming from the DevOps teams to make sure the guardrails have been followed and allowing the change to flow through with little or no approval when that happens. But equally, as we can see later, we can apply some operational data, we can apply some checks and balances to that change, and we can route the change for approval if we need to. So we have the ideal change models on one side, and as I pointed out, we have no plans to get rid of these changes or retire them. They will be around for a long time, and we'll continue to support them. Standard change has a very valid purpose still in organizations. There's still a lot of changes that we do that we need to have in a catalog with a template that people can just repeat. They make things very fast, and it's a very efficient way of working. But what we want to do is make normal change smaller. As you can see, the size of that planet has shrunk. And now we've got federated change models over to the right-hand side. So what we're doing with these models is creating a very specific way of working. And within ServiceNow Change, the first thing we can do is lock down these changes so only the right people can use them. So there's mechanisms for doing that. So we know that we can't run an app change through the infra model or through the low risk model. We've got different types of changes as well that'll follow different approval policies. So within here, we can reuse state models. We'll talk about that later. We can reuse approval policies. We can reuse business rules. We can do that, but we can also create our own versions of approval policies which fit just that change. And because we know only the right people are following that type of change, we know only they are going to follow that path. We've got in here low risk change as well, which is kind of that area that we talked about before, which is where changes are not necessarily standard change, but we want some checks and balances applied to them. A lot of changes in an organization fall into this category. So in here, you might do a check, like to see how successful a particular team are at making changes. There's more about that later. You might see whether there's currently a P1 on the system that they're going to reboot the server on, something that would normally be a standard change, but you don't want to do it in the case where there is some operational issue at the moment. And so we can look at operational data, we can look at the performance of the teams or the performance of that template. Also, within that, we can actually check dynamically at the time the change is raised whether something has happened in the last few days. So we can actually check to see whether it's still a valid standard change template or low risk change template at the time the change is made. And we can route the change for more approval if we've seen some issues recently. And so that reduces the amount of work we have to do in maintaining our standard change catalog. By having low risk change, not only are we having more assurance around what's going on within the changes, we also are able to put more changes into that kind of high velocity, low effort category. And we can also provide logic to allow those changes to be checked at the time they're being raised, at the time they're being implemented, to make sure that the assumptions we made around making that a low risk change are still valid, and route the change appropriately if those assumptions aren't. So again, just talking about moving the change, moving DevOps change out of standard change and into its own model. And then this allows us to have a purpose-specific change for DevOps that allows them to utilize the integrations, utilize the data they've got in the systems, allows them to continue working where they were working before, but provides data to operational systems, to ServiceNow, so people have visibility of what they're doing and allow those changes to flow faster without compromising our compliance. So just looking at some of the components that we have in ServiceNow around these changes. So traditionally, again, if something went into the normal change process or went into the standard change process or the emergency change process, we'd have a set of states that it followed, and those would be kind of bolted down, right? You'd need to follow all those states. So most changes that an organization does that are following the normal change process, because most changes do, would have to go through all those states. And by having a purpose-specific change, what we can do is we can tailor the states for that type of change. If we want to, we can skip states and just not have them in that particular model of change. But we also know for that way of working, for that team that are able to raise changes with that model, they are going to follow a specific state flow. And the importance of state flows as well is that, again, they're reusable. So we're not talking about building a new set of states for each one of the models you build. You reuse your states. You just tailor the state flow to fit the model. And that comes down into workflow as well, because we've implemented state-based workflows. So whereas before we had one monolithic workflow for the entire normal change process or emergency change process, that workflow would have to go end to end and would have to have conditions that roll things back, that move things forward, that cater for different changes. So the state transition was quite tricky to tailor, because if you didn't move from one state to another, the workflow wouldn't be able to handle it, or there'd be really complex logic to allow it to be handled. So by decoupling the workflow and having it state-based, each one of the states will run its own workflow. That means we can chain together states in different orders, and we've got an example of that later. We have specific approval policies. Again, the approval policies are reusable items. We can call them from workflows. So we don't have to build a different approval policy for each one of our models, or several approval policies for each one of the models. We can reuse them. But the point is, we can build approval policies if we want to take into account specific data. And again, we'll give some examples of that later. We can take into account structured data as well with our changes. So whereas before, for a normal change, we'd be looking across the organization. So there's very little opportunity to take in specific data that's provided from one system to another. So if we're looking at infrastructure as code, or if we're looking at DevOps, we can't go and key into that data and start bringing it back and using it in the change process easily. We've allowed out a lot of variance within the change process. So looking at the federated change models, you can see they have different amounts of approvals in them. They have different amounts of use of templates. They have different workflows. Some of them may be state-based flows, some of them not. The advantage of starting with change models is you can continue to do normal change the way you're doing it. You can continue to use workflow with normal change. We don't recommend it. We recommend you move to flow. But if you want to, you can break off these new models and start experimenting with them with a very small group, because we can lock it down so only certain people can use that type of change, that new model of change. And you can start to learn about how to do state-based flows, how to use approval policies, how to use modern risk management. And you can start to apply templates to those things as well that are used for that one. So looking specifically at some of the flows in here and the state model, because that's one of the key things about change models. You can see in here, we have the normal change flow, which goes through normal, assess, authorize, schedule, implement, review, and flows. So as a change flows through them, the normal changes will continue to flow through that path. But you can see in here, for change registration, for example, we just go through schedule, implement, review, close. So this is an example of a change where it's an informational change. We don't need to go through all the steps we had for normal change. We don't need to modify the normal change workflow to say if it's coming from this vendor, or if it's got these aspects of the change, then we will just skip these states. We don't follow them. That would make the normal change process more complex. We can have a specific process, a specific state model, and a specific set of components that work for change registration. And not only that, when we look at those changes, when we look at our changes overall, we'll be able to identify which changes via the model were following the change registration path. Looking at unauthorized change as well. For an authorized change, it's no longer an emergency change. You can see it comes in new, we review it, we authorize it, we close it. There's no point in scheduling it because it's already happened. So by minimizing the amount of states a change goes through, we're simplifying the change process, we're making it more efficient, and we're also making normal change easier to use. So just some of the features that we use within change. So change approval policies allow us to take data in that's specific to that type of change. There's some things which are fairly generic, right? We may just look at the risk of a change like we do in normal change and route it to CAB if it's high risk, and then route it for approval if it's low or medium. But you can see in this example, we've got a specific set of policies for DevOps changes. So we can look at things like whether integration tests failed. We can look at things like whether there's branch protection enabled on the pipeline. We can also look at things like operational data. So your DevOps teams won't currently have visibility of this when they run their pipeline. It's very unlikely that they'll know whether there's currently an open incident or whether there's been an outage in the last 7 days. It may be that your policy says, if this team have caused an outage in the last 7 days, we need to have a manual check, a minimal manual check on the change before it moves forward. We may want to do something like conflict checking and check across the organization to see whether other changes are taking place at the time, to minimize the amount that we could have 2 changes that cross over and cause an outage or cause some kind of disruption. So what we're doing with the dynamic approval engine is we're taking structured data, we're ingesting it in to give us decisions around approval. And we're able to attach that on a model and make it specific to that type of change. So we know only that group following that type of change will have that type of approval applied to them. It's fit for purpose. And from the decision, from our approval policy, we get a clear decision. It can either be approved or rejected or go to manual review. So it can go for manual approval in the traditional way. It can even go to CAB if we wanted to. We can route these things through approval policies as we see fit. Dynamic risk evaluation allows us to take different aspects of the change. Now, most of us will be doing some form of risk evaluation on a change. Most people will be doing risk assessments. They'll ask some questions of the person raising the change via a structured survey. And it's a good way to do things. It's a good way to capture information, but it can be gamed. We see customers where people fill this in numerous times to get the right answer on a change. And although we have documented what their answers were when they gave them, so we do have an audit trail, it's better than just getting them to put a risk in. It still has its weaknesses, but it's still a good way of doing things. We have risk conditions. So this is looking at some of the things which you may already have as questions in your risk assessment. It may be something like, is the change to a critical service? Well, if you have a CMDB, you should be able to tell that. You should be able to tell whether that CI is part of a critical service or not. So instead of asking the question in a risk assessment, we can automatically ask the question via a risk condition. And again, we can set the risk on a change via these risk conditions firing. And we can also make a calculated risk score. So we can take the probability of something happening and the impact of that happening and look them up and apply like a secondary risk score from that too. And then we have risk intelligence. So all our ITSM Pro customers have machine learning for change on the systems. You may well not have enabled it yet, but it's a really good implementation of machine learning. What this does is it looks back and clusters changes using either a similarity or classification algorithm, and then we'll give you a risk score based on features of those changes and whether they were successful or whether they failed. And it's a very accurate way of telling whether changes are likely to succeed or fail. We find it has really good results in the field. The customers that we know are using it, they're using it at scale, and it's producing good results. So what this does is all those particular aspects of risk come into a dynamic risk score, and we look at them and we take the highest risk that's presented to us. So if machine learning comes back and says it's low risk, but the risk assessment says it's high, we'll take a high score. As you can see in here, the calculated risk score was high. So that allows us to make sure that we're always looking at the data which gives us the highest risk. So if machine learning, again, if it comes back and says something's high and the questions we asked said it was low, it will come back with a high score for risk. And that's the best way of doing it. That way we can make sure that, that if any aspect of a change comes back with a high risk score, it's routed according to that score. And that's our derived risk score. So change success scores, a lot of our customers are using change success scores. And what we do is we look at the team who are implementing the change and we look at what's happened over the last 30 days with that team. And we look at aspects like, and this is configurable, how many successful and unsuccessful changes they've had, how many outages they've caused, how many P1s they've caused. And we apply a multiplier to those numbers and we get a score from that. That is calculated every day using a platform analytics job. So we get a change success scorecard for each team. We also get a scorecard for change models, so we can see how well a model is performing. We also get a scorecard for standard changes, which is calculated slightly differently. So we can look at this when the change is being assessed. We can get it to contribute to that derived risk score. But what we can also do is we can build it into approval policies. And there's a link to a blog which talks about that at the end of the presentation. So what we can do is, the example with standard change before, is we can look at a change, a low risk change, but then we can then see whether the particular team doing that type of change has failed recently, and maybe route the change if they're failing a lot. Maybe route the change for some manual approval. Equally with a DevOps team, it may be that a team are doing a DevOps process. They've told us that they have all the guardrails in place, but they just keep on breaking stuff. So we want to have some manual checks on their change until they get to a point where their changes are succeeding again. Again, by applying a success score in an approval policy as part of your change model, you can interrogate the success of the team or the success of the model, and you can build in dynamic risk into your change. So another one of our products, DevOps Change Velocity, what this does is it allows developers to work in the platform they're used to working in. And there are lots of systems out there. We have lots of integrations to these systems. We can bring in data on what they're planning to do on the stories and work items that they're preparing. We can hook into their pipelines and we can see what they're planning to commit. We can see where the code is in the repo that they're working on. And as the pipeline runs, we can feed that data into ServiceNow. So we can link that data together. And that means that when we look at a change, we can assess the data that's coming from the DevOps systems. So we can start looking to see whether they included stories with their commit, because developer teams should be having stories that describe what they're doing in the commit they're making. We can see what the test results are, because the pipeline should contain high-level data on the test results and security scans for that DevOps process, for that pipeline run. And we can also make round trips to other systems. We can bring back detailed test coverage from systems like Selenium. And we can see what the actual test results were. And again, it's recorded on the change. So when we make approval decisions, as you saw before, we're looking at this data, but we're also recording why the decision was made on the change, why we decided to route this for no approval at all, because all the guardrails were adhered to. And we also have details of exactly what tests were done, or we can have, on a change, which is created via DevOps. And so these changes are created automatically as the pipeline runs. It fires a change in ServiceNow. It sends us the data. We attach it all within ServiceNow. We put that into the change record and we route the change accordingly. And what this also allows us to do is, as we have teams working across various systems of various technologies in the organization, you might have people using Azure DevOps on one side of the business and the Jira stack on the other side of the business. There may be multiple Jira stacks where people are doing different teams that are federated around the organization, have bought their own instances of Jira and are happily working away on them. We can integrate with all of them, and we can provide visibility of their performance from ServiceNow, from your operational platform. And what this does is not only allows them to see across the DevOps world, but also allows you to then, when you've attached that DevOps data to the CMDB and the common service data model, it allows you to slice and dice that data by other things, like how is a service performing? What's the velocity of change for a given service that's using DevOps? So we have, again, out-of-the-box metrics. We have the DORA metrics, which is an industry standard. We have other metrics as well, which we can provide insight into what's happening on the DevOps stack. And that allows change managers to see how the DevOps teams are performing, to understand what good looks like in DevOps and where teams are not performing so well, and take steps to remediate where we're having issues, and potentially reward teams that are doing well by allowing them to make changes faster. Okay, so now we have a comparison between two types of changes. And you can see in here, we've got the normal change life cycle, and we've got all the stages of that change life cycle. And that change requester would be asked to fill in the form. At the start of the webinar, we asked the question around making change easier for our change raisers. And so a normal change doesn't really know a lot about the change that's coming in. It doesn't really know what data you've got to fill in that change, apart from a few kind of key mandatory fields. By using change models, you're able to focus the person who's raising the change to fill in the details that they need to fill in for that change. So we can highlight for that particular type of change what data is pertinent, what we need to move on. For a normal change, we just can't do that because we don't know what type of change they're raising to start off with. It's not purpose driven. But they fill out that change and they do a risk evaluation. Again, a standard risk evaluation for all those changes, not a specific one for that particular model of change. Then the approval happens, again, a generic one, which has to look across all the types of change which could be in normal, and is either very complex or will be slightly paranoid and route the changes for a lot of approval, maybe unnecessarily. And more approval means more work. So it's a rough proxy for how much work you're doing in your change process, for how many approvals you're generating. When you're generating a lot of approvals, not only the change team having to do a lot of work, people around the business are having to do a lot of work as well. A lot of stakeholders involved in the change, stakeholder complexity, also normally increases the possibility that that change could have an adverse effect on stability. We schedule the changes, we implement them, we review them, we close them. Again, no specific processes around this for a normal change. So you can see in here, we've got a cloud infrastructure change model. So we know what changes we would expect from cloud infra when that's raised. So because we're using a specific model, we can target that form, that experience around raising the change to that particular persona who's raising the change. And we can make sure only they can open that type of change. We can use dynamic risk in a way that's appropriate for that type of change as well. We can have approval policy automation. We can look at the performance of that team and route the change for approval if they're performing badly, or maybe route it through with minimal or no approval if they're not. Also, we should, for a lot of processes, the things like DevOps, things like cloud infra, a lot of the assessments done to the left of the change process. If we know that's happening, if we have good evidence that's happening, we can skip the assess stage for that change because we can bring that information into the change through DevOps integrations. So then when we've authorized it, that change will happen straight away. We have automation that fires that will run the change, will run it into a production environment. We can check for scheduling, we can do automatic conflict checks to make sure it's not going to clash with something else. And we can hold the change in the authorized stage. We can not authorize it until those things are resolved. But when that change is cleared to go, we may not get an indication back from those systems. In a lot of cases, they don't call back to us. So what we do is when they authorize the change, we don't need schedule, implement, or review anymore. We just close out the change. So that allows us to minimize the amount of states that a cloud infrastructure change model will go through. Now, your implementation of cloud infrastructure may vary. This is just an example, but it's to show that in this particular instance, we don't need all the states that we're going through the normal change process. By using a change model, not only have we minimized the amount of states that we're moving through in the change, we've also implemented specific policies around approval, around risk, around the workflow, and around the process of raising and filling in that change. So the adoption journey. We recommend as a first step, people move towards looking at potential models they can set up. And we recommend that they move over to the normal standard emergency models within ServiceNow, because effectively it's just a label on a form to start off with. So we're just replacing the type field on the form with a model that says normal standard emergency. And you can use existing workflows, you can use existing approvals around this, you can use the work that you've already done in ServiceNow with those changes. And you don't have to move away from that immediately. But what you can do is you can start breaking off types of change, like for instance, DevOps, like for instance, patching, like low risk change, and start experimenting with teams. And then that allows you to create the governance for those teams as they're moving forward. So it allows you to update your compliance and policy documents for that particular team, to work with them to understand how the new components in ServiceNow work, to work to understand how you onboard those teams and how you assure the quality of the changes they're doing. And then you can scale that out. By leveraging the data that those teams provide in that particular model, you can start to understand the data that exists around your organization. You can start to bring it into the change process. And what that does is allows you to build traceability of the changes that they're creating. So for things like DevOps, we're automatically creating the changes. We know what pipeline run they came from. We know what artifacts have been deployed. And this not only helps the change process, it helps downstream process, like operations, understanding what stories were deployed in that particular commit, or like security processes, wanting to know what particular artifact has made its way where in the business. And that gives us the opportunity to have full change automation. So where we have a shift left system that's robust and has done all the checks before we raise a change, this allows us to use that and make the change process really lightweight. But we're still checking to see whether they've done those things. We're still checking with approval policies to make sure the guardrails are in place, that we've got the data, we've received it in ServiceNow. We're still checking with success scores to make sure those teams are performing well, they're not breaking stuff. And all these things, this automation allows change managers, as I said before, to step back from being first-line change managers into more of a second-line process management, which allows them to have oversight of the changes, to start looking for opportunities with automation, with maybe new models or tweaking existing models, to start looking at low-performing teams, to start looking at where there are trends in stability, to start implementing things like machine learning for risk, or maybe further on down the line, Gen AI. So as you mature along this curve, by breaking off change models and by having a specific change model to take some of the changes out of normal change, you're making normal change less complex. And you're making the change that you're starting to build as a model more specific, higher velocity, potentially higher stability, and you're potentially increasing your chances of doing some automation and decreasing the workload on the change team. So that's how we see the maturity path towards being able to have velocity and volume, stability and compliance within the envelope without compromising the stability of the team. Okay, next question. Caelan, do you want to read it out?
Of course. All right, I'm launching the poll. So this is our final poll question. So have you started modernizing change? And if so, how are you using ServiceNow to do this? We have all those capabilities that we just talked about here today. You can answer and select all that apply. And please be honest. Another 20 or so seconds. All right, and the poll and share. So it looks like about half of those on the call have not yet started using any of these capabilities. So hopefully after today's session, these seem interesting to you, and you'll begin testing those out in subprod. But a good portion are also starting to use change models and approval policies, about a quarter. So that's good to see. All right. So we have, I think, one more slide that's kind of like a call to action. That slide, Daniel, and then we'll kick off Q&A. So first call to action is just begin experimenting with these capabilities that we talked about in your subprod environment. We have a number of blogs on our community. We'll send those out in our post-meeting invite. So you can reference those community blogs to learn more about these capabilities beyond what we shared today, and also to just help you get started with those. And also, if you have any questions, please engage with us. We'll be working on monitoring the ITSM forum for any community posts around change and responding to those there. Okay, with that, let's transition into Q&A. We have a couple questions here that we flagged to answer live. So I'll go ahead and ask these, and Daniel, I'll let you respond. So first question's from Pierre. Creating change models outside what ServiceNow made available out of the boxes can be relatively cumbersome. Are organizations meant to try to stick to what's available, or is there flexibility to implement new models that align to an organization?
Yeah, so first thing is I don't think change is is short on features or features that deliver value. I think what we may need to, or we do need to improve on, is customers' ability to adopt these things. And change models is a great example of it. We want to make things easier for you to do for a start. So over the next few releases, we're going to try and make things easier for you to configure in terms of models, in terms of having set up around those models and easy access to be able to configure them, and information around where you would identify change models and what you do around them. And the components that we talked about, the things like approval policies, flows, where those things are, where they live, and how you reuse them. We do provide some basic models out of the box, but with everything change, they're just a template, they're a starting point. We don't expect customers to be able to use change completely out of the box on day one, because most customers will have nuances around how their change process works. We expect to be most of the way there. So the models we provide out of the box for you are there for you to start, for you to either go in and use, or to configure on your own, or to copy and create your own versions of. So the answer is that every organization will probably have very similar types of models or models in play, but they won't be identical to each other. So yeah, go out there and create your own change models, and let us know how it's going. Let us know how easy you find that and where you find blockers.
Next question's from Roland. Many clients split the project and development change process and change release from each other. How does this fit into the federated change model?
So we have another product that we use for release management. So separation of release and deploy is something that we are supporting at ServiceNow. So again, things like normal changes will continue to use the change process that we've known for years. But where we see teams that are doing very rapid deployments, there's normally an overarching release process. And I think we have we had, or do we have another webinar coming up on digital product release? Phelan,
we've had one so far. We do have another one planned that's actually going to be kind of a joint webinar between change and release. So modern change plus digital product release.
Yeah,
that'll be, I think, in June.
Yeah. So, but in those cases where you have a separation of release and deploy, where you're doing checks on what's happening in the release, so kind of feature level stuff, business checks, business sign off, operational readiness, and you need to tie the change into that. That's the direction that we're moving for separation of release and deploy. But change models are really important, that because, like I said before, you will have normal changes that continue to work in the way they've always worked, and we need to support that. We want to support it, but we are looking towards ways as well, and we have a new product around release management that will support separation of release and deploy, so you can do rapid changes with minimal approval within change management for your deployments, and the release can be handled as a kind of longer span over the top of multiple deployments.
All right, next question from Seb. Have you ever seen all this successfully applied to any customers? If so, how long would this take to put in place in a conservative IT environment, the traditional change process?
So I think it's something you do gradually. Yes, we have seen customers rolling this out. I think the traction has been, we've had now, I think change models have been in play for a few releases. I think probably 6 to 8 releases. Someone might be able to correct me on that. And I think we've advertised them. I think that there's been more of an organizational imperative over the last couple of years to do this. So what I've been hearing is that the change being a blocker to the organization's velocity, the wider organization, is what customers are reporting to me more and more. And so that's driving, again, over the last 2 years, has driven more of a need to look at how change is done. And so people are looking at change models first, and then looking at things like dynamic approval policies and different ways of doing flow and risk as part of that. Different customers move forward in different ways at different times. A lot of customers will do models first, and that's the right thing to do. We have customers who are actively using machine learning for risk. We have customers who are actively using dynamic approval policies. We have lots of customers on DevOps now who are making lots and lots of DevOps changes with little or no approval, and bringing the DevOps data into the system as well, and driving insight into the DevOps system. So, if you have a lot of DevOps teams out there, then you're probably best setting up a DevOps model first and moving with DevOps first. If you have a lot of patching going on, then set up a patching model and work with that. If you have an issue with risk management, if risk management is slowing you down, or it's an area where you're not performing particularly well, then look at risk management. But I'd look at models first. And just another note in terms of maturity, that the curve doesn't have to be executed across the board all in one go. So you've got a maturity curve, and you look at doing models, you look at trying to have approval policies, you look at trying to embed dynamic risk inside those approval policies, and using dynamic risk within change. You could have models that are moved all the way forward with that, because you're getting good data from them, because those teams are willing to work with you to do their change differently, that you trust them to work in that way. And you have other teams that you've kind of held back on because they're not particularly good at performing change, or the data isn't very good, or the CMDB isn't very good in that area. So I don't think it's a case of having, this is one of the points, it's not a case of having to move everything for normal change all in one go as one big transformation project that would take 2 years. It's about kind of spinning one bit off and experimenting with it, and then scaling that as fast as you can, as fast as you're allowed to do within your budgets, your constraints. So there's no single answer to that, how long it takes. I think it takes, the faster you do it, the more budget you'll need, probably the more risk you're taking with it. But by taking a structured approach and using models, you can reduce that risk and mitigate it.
Great response, Daniel. All right, next question. How important is a functional CMDB to drive these processes?
Very important. I think so change, traditionally the custodians of the CMDB. So change, the quality of the CMDB is also driven by the quality of the change process. And that's for a lot of normal changes. And then you move into kind of the cloud paradigm, and the CMDB starts to kind of shrink a little, because you've got these kind of big entities that sit in the cloud that are very complex, but may only be represented by a few CIs, an API, maybe a microservice infrastructure, which is actually a big thing in the cloud, and it scales up and scales down. And even that scaling is not being controlled by change, right? You don't raise a change when you get more nodes added to your microservice, if that's the right term to use even. So what we do is, by having different ways of doing change, you can start looking at the CMDB slightly differently for cloud native environments, for instance. So for there, you start looking more at when configuration changes in the cloud. So when you change the setting that allows you to scale, or how you scale, when you change cache sizes, you want to start looking at that kind of thing. So I think the CMDB is changing. There's still a lot of traditional CMDB, and there will be for years. And that's really important. It's important for knowing the impact of things, that CMDB is well mapped, that you understand what services connect, how services connect to each other, because you won't be able to do effective impacting unless that happens. But I'd say more and more, there's automation which is available to help us populate the CMDB. And the ITOM folks will talk about that, but there's more automation around populating the CMDB. As we hook into pipelines and they tell us what's being deployed, then there's opportunities for us there to automate what's happening in the CMDB.
All right, this next question has come twice. How do we solve the problem where approvers from a team are very slow at approving changes, causing changes to be rescheduled as they miss their intended implementation windows? A little bit different from the topics we talked about, but they came up twice.
Chase them.
Throw
them up. So if you have less approvers, you need to do less work on the change. If there are changes that don't need approval, people will have less approvals. They'll probably take less time to do approvals. If you can push things out to their devices, if you can push things out to like Microsoft Teams, if you can push things out to their mobile phones and mobile devices, you may get approvals faster. If you can provide more information with those approvals, so allow them to make an approval with good information from that device, for instance, then maybe that's something you can do too. There are opportunities out there to speed up approval, make approval easier. And also just by minimizing approval. So if you have a change that needs to go to cab, then you're going to have to pull a load of people into a room and make a decision. And that's going to be around as well for a long time. But there are lots of changes that are done that need minimal approval, and we're probably putting too many approvers into change. So again, looking at how many approvers are on the changes and whether those approvers are really needed and how many times a change just gets approved is an important part of making the approval process as efficient as possible.
All right, next question is, how do most handle unplanned changes that are not emergency changes and fall outside the normal change windows?
So I don't, so you could have a specific model for them. I'm not sure if you mean changes that are in retrospect. So I'll answer that one first. So you can have there is a specific model that we provide out of the box for unauthorized changes that happen that you're approving in retrospect. And there's a certain amount of urgency about understanding when they are to a critical system, and you want to have that approved because you could get some audit coming along that says that not only did the change happen, there's been no approval process around the change. I think where there's a large number of changes being made to a system, you can start to identify, it's more like identifying trends and working out why you're getting changes made in that system and why they're happening. If it's not particularly impactful or not on a particularly critical system, it can also show potential security vulnerabilities, where you've got things like MAC addresses changing randomly around the organization. Some of those, or even one of them, could be a vulnerability. So I think it's about understanding for an authorized change what process picks that up. So sometimes it'll be change management picking it up to make sure that has been authorized, to make sure they close the loop and it doesn't happen that way in the future. I think sometimes it'll be security teams picking up on it. It's not really a change thing. It's more like, again, with the MAC addresses, it's more like understanding why we've got these things appearing on the network that weren't there before and there wasn't a change raise for them. So it loops into another process, a vulnerability process, possibly.
All right. Next question from Carl. Will anyone be available to discuss modern change one-on-one at Knowledge? So I think the answer is yes. Eileen will be there, and Anand. Anyone else that you know of, Daniel? We'll have a modern change demo at Knowledge, actually.
I'm just trying to think. There will be people there, though, yes. I'm not there.
All right. Next question from Seb. Coming back to CMDB, what can be achieved without confidence in your CMDB data? How would you push change process innovation with an immature configuration data?
I think without so if you know what service something is, if you have a services set up within your organization, if you know how technology has been delivered and who owns it, you can make them responsible for the changes in that area. So maybe you don't know all the CIs in their area, or maybe you don't know how those CIs are connected to each other, but you do know that all the Windows servers in, I don't know, in Atlanta are owned by this particular person. If you route the changes to them, so that will be using something called dynamic queries within CMDB to link together a set of CIs with particular attributes to a particular service or service offering, and then to a particular person. By making them responsible for the changes that are happening on their systems, you can drive an effective change process, because change is about responsibility. And also, by understanding that there are limitations to that area of the CMDB, it may lead you to think that your ability to determine impact and determine risk is going to be pretty low. So you would probably make that change a little bit more risky than something where you have a lot of detail in that area, and that would affect that particular service owner's ability to make changes, that technology owner's ability to make changes fast. So by pushing back to them the need to improve the CMDB in their area, and by getting them to engage with the config team around how they do that, maybe through discovery, through service mapping, through better integrations, you can drive better quality. And that's kind of a little bit about how you gamify change, right? You allow people who have good quality CMDBs, that keep them up to date, that follow good processes, that have good practice. You allow them to move fast with minimal approvals on change. The right approvals, but minimal approvals, because they're providing data to the change that allows you to do that, right? It's auditable. No one's breaking any rules. If systems are not well recorded, if you don't know what's in your CMDB, then there'll be more manual checking. Another approach is by having things like cabs and inviting people, and having a policy where if you don't show up, the change is going to go ahead. So, rather than kind of broadcast approvals across to a wide section of the organization and expect them all to approve it before the change can go forward, which will probably mean they won't have approved it by the time that you need to do the change. Cabs can be a really effective way of managing change, and specific cabs, network cabs, cloud management cabs, application cabs, whatever it happens to be, security cabs, whatever you're setting up in that area. You can drive some quality just by having structured meetings where people are invited and decisions are made by committee. And that's sometimes what you need to do. If you don't have the data, then people need to look at the change, and maybe they need to pull a blueprint out of the top drawer of their desk and have a look at it before the change is approved. But if they've attested to the change, if they've approved it, that shows they've done that.
Right, we're about at time. I'm just going to address one question that I saw here, and then the questions that we didn't get to, we have them listed here. We're going to respond to them offline and send you all emails of the answers. But one question from Seb that thanks for love to everyone. Please advertise the upcoming webinars via the post-meeting email. I'll make sure to do that. Look out for that email. It'll probably come in a few days, because we're looking to publish this webinar recording to a place that you can reference it in the future. But like I said, there's a number of questions here. We're going to work to answer these and get back to you. Please fill out that post-session survey. particularly if you have any interest in engaging with us on anything that we talked about today, you can indicate that there. And thank you for your attention today. It's been a really great session. Appreciate
Yeah.
all the participation.
Thanks for turning up.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, Howell.